This is 2 hours of the most hated characters in Family Guy history. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's start with a character who might have had the single biggest fall from grace in animated television history. Family Guy has been on the air since 1999. Seth MacFarlane created it, Fox cancelled it twice, fans petitioned to bring it back both times, and somehow the show is still going with over 440 episodes across 24 seasons and counting. That's a long time for any show to stay on television. And when a show runs that long, something happens to the characters. They change. Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get deeper and more interesting. But in Family Guy's case, a lot of the characters got worse, significantly worse, and the fan community has spent years arguing about exactly which characters fell the hardest and which ones became genuinely difficult to watch. What we're going to do today is go through the most hated characters, one by one, talk about what made fans turn on them, look at the specific episodes that sealed their fates, and dig into the psychology behind why these transformations happened the way they did. Every episode mentioned here is real. Every season number is accurate. Every plot detail has been checked against the actual show. And if you happen to fall asleep during any of this, that's completely fine. That's kind of the point. But if you stay awake, you're going to see Family Guy in a way you probably haven't before. Because when you line up all the worst moments from all the worst characters and really look at the patterns, it tells you something pretty uncomfortable about what this show became over the last 2.5 decades. And we're starting with the character who fans say suffered the single worst transformation in the show's entire run. A character who went from being the emotional heart of Family Guy to someone that even other characters on the show openly despise. We're talking about Brian Griffin, the family dog, and his story is honestly kind of heartbreaking when you really look at what happened. So here's the thing about Brian that a lot of people forget if they only started watching Family Guy in the later seasons. In the beginning, Brian was the best character on the show. That's not an exaggeration. For the first 7 or 8 seasons, Brian Griffin was the most grounded, most thoughtful, most genuinely likable person in the entire Griffin household. And yeah, I said person because that was always the joke with Brian. He was technically a dog, a white Labrador, but he was more human than the actual humans around him. He walked on 2 legs, he drove a car, he drank martinis, he read books, he had opinions about politics and culture and philosophy. And unlike Peter, who was lovable but dangerously stupid, or Stewie, who was brilliant but psychotic, Brian was the voice of reason. He was the guy who would look at whatever insane thing was happening in the Griffin house and say what the audience was already thinking. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian using his own natural speaking voice. That's a detail that matters because it tells you how personal this character was to the creator of the show. Every other character MacFarlane voices, Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, they all have exaggerated cartoon voices. Brian is the only one where MacFarlane just talks normally. Brian was MacFarlane's avatar in the show, the character he related to the most, the one he used to express his own views about the world. And early Brian had real depth. He wasn't just a sarcastic talking dog. He had a backstory that was genuinely sad. Brian was born in a puppy mill in Austin, Texas. He was taken from his mother as a pup and adopted by a family called the Hendersons, who eventually stopped looking for him when he went missing. He became a stray, lived on the streets. And then Peter picked him up on the side of a highway and brought him home. That origin story gave Brian this underlying sadness that made him feel real. He wasn't just cracking jokes. He was a character who had experienced loss and abandonment and was trying to build a life for himself despite all of that. One of the most raw moments in the entire series comes in Season 8, Episode 17, an episode called Brian and Stewie. This was a bottle episode, which means the entire thing takes place in one location with just 2 characters. Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault overnight. No cutaway gags, no musical numbers, no other characters, just the 2 of them talking. And during that conversation, Stewie discovers that Brian keeps a loaded gun in his safe deposit box. When Stewie asks why, Brian admits that he keeps it there in case he ever wants to kill himself. He tells Stewie that the only reason he hasn't done it is because of Stewie, because their friendship gives him something to live for. That scene aired on television in 2010. A cartoon dog talking about suicidal ideation in a kids' show time slot. And it worked because the character had been built with enough depth over the previous 8 seasons that the audience actually cared about his pain. Brian's friendship with Stewie was the emotional backbone of the entire show. The road to episodes where Brian and Stewie go on these buddy adventure stories together are consistently rated among the best episodes Family Guy ever produced. Their dynamic worked because they were opposites who genuinely needed each other. Stewie was a genius baby with no emotional intelligence. Brian was an emotionally complex adult with an inflated sense of his own intellect. Together, they balanced each other out. Stewie pushed Brian to be braver. Brian taught Stewie how to be vulnerable. It was the one relationship on the show that felt completely real. So what happened? How did this character, this sophisticated, cultured, emotionally layered talking dog, become one of the most hated characters in animation history? The answer is something fans call Flanderization. It's a term that comes from The Simpsons, named after Ned Flanders, where a character's personality gets reduced to a single, exaggerated trait over time. And Brian Griffin might be the single most extreme example of Flanderization in cartoon history. Starting around season 9, the writers began stripping away every redeeming quality Brian had and replacing them with his worst impulses. The sarcastic wit became smug arrogance. The cultured intellectual became a pretentious fraud. The loyal friend became a selfish manipulator. And the voice of reason became a preachy hypocrite who couldn't practice a single thing he preached. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened, because the specific episodes tell the story better than any summary could. In Season 6, Episode 10, an episode called Play It Again, Brian finally acts on his long simmering crush on Lois. The family goes on a weekend retreat, and Brian tries to kiss her. Peter finds out, and they get into a real fight. Brian promises afterward that nothing like that would ever happen again. And for a moment, it seems like the show is going to address Brian's feelings for Lois in a mature way and move on. But they didn't move on. In later seasons, Brian keeps trying to get with Lois. He keeps hitting on his best friend's wife, the man who took him off the street, who feeds him, who gave him a home, who saved him from being a stray. And Brian repays that by repeatedly trying to steal his wife. Quagmire later calls him out for exactly this, and he's right. In Season 8, Episode 8, an episode called Doggone, Brian discovers that the only people who actually enjoy his novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, are intellectually disabled readers at a pizza parlor book club. He gets drunk over the realization that he's a terrible writer, then accidentally runs over another dog on his way home. He tries to hide the body, and when he eventually confesses, nobody cares because it's just a dog. The episode has some interesting ideas about how society values animal life, but it also plants this seed that Brian's entire identity as an intellectual is built on sand. He thinks he's smart, he thinks he's talented, and the show keeps giving us evidence that he's neither. This really comes to a head in Season 13, Episode 8, called Our Idiot Brian. Meg is worried about passing her SATs and asks Brian to take the test for her, since he's supposed to be the genius of the family. Brian agrees, poses as Meg at the school, takes the test, and fails badly. Not just below average, he bombs it completely. The supposed intellectual of the Griffin household can't pass a standardized test designed for high school students. When this becomes public knowledge, it becomes a running joke that Brian is actually dumb. Peter starts taking him to do stupid people activities like demolition derbies and visiting Florida. Brian leans into it and starts enjoying being an idiot, which is when Stewie discovers Brian has a brain tumor that's been affecting his cognition. After the tumour is removed, Brian goes back to his normal pretentious self. But the damage is done. The show has explicitly shown us that Brian's intelligence was always questionable, and his pretension was always a performance. And the worst part is how Brian treats the people around him when his ego is involved. In Season 13, Episode 4, called Brian the Closer, Peter accidentally smashes out all of Brian's teeth. Nobody in the family wants to pay for the dental work. The one person who steps up is Quagmire, of all people. Quagmire, who openly hates Brian, gives him the number to his own dentist and puts it on his personal account. Brian gets a new smile and lands a job in real estate. And how does he repay Quagmire's generosity? He scams Quagmire into buying a terrible, run-down property by lying about its condition. He sells his benefactor a piece of garbage, then hides for 72 hours until the return window closes. Quagmire eventually catches up to him, and Brian gives this fake speech about how he's a selfish and pretentious jerk. But it's just a ploy to waste time until the deadline passes. This is who Brian became. A character who will exploit the one person who showed him kindness, just to make a sale. Then there's his treatment of women, which went from complicated to genuinely gross over the course of the show. Early Brian had real relationships. He dated a woman named Gillian who wasn't the smartest person, but he seemed to genuinely care about her. He had a poignant arc with an elderly woman named Rita in Season 8, where he fell for someone his own age for once and had to defend the relationship against the family's mockery. But as the seasons went on, Brian started treating women as disposable objects. He'd pursue attractive women with elaborate lies about who he was, sleep with them, and then discard them the second things got complicated. He abandoned his own son, Dylan, after getting a woman named Tracy pregnant years earlier. When he finally met Dylan in a later season, he was obnoxious about his parenting skills, criticizing Peter and Lois while having done literally nothing for his own kid. And then he lost interest in Dylan again and just stopped being a father entirely. And then there's the herpes incident, which fans consider one of the absolute lowest moments for Brian's character. Brian convinces Stewie to do a blood brother ritual with him, cutting their fingers and pressing them together. What Brian doesn't tell Stewie is that he has herpes. He knowingly gives a baby, his best friend's baby, a lifelong STD, and treats it like it's no big deal. He also transmits it to Chris the same way. Keep in mind, Stewie is an infant. Brian infected a baby with herpes through deliberate deception. That's not a character flaw played for laughs. That's just awful. But the single moment that changed how fans viewed Brian forever happened in Season 8, Episode 7, an episode called Jerome is the New Black. The main plot is about the group trying to find a new fourth friend after Cleveland moved away, and they end up befriending a guy named Jerome, who turns out to be Lois's ex-boyfriend. Peter gets jealous, burns down Jerome's house, and the usual Peter chaos ensues. But the subplot is what everyone remembers. Brian finds out that Quagmire hates him. Really deeply hates him. Brian tries to fix the situation by tricking Quagmire into a dinner where they can talk it out. And at that dinner, Quagmire finally tells Brian exactly why he can't stand him. And the speech is devastating. Quagmire tells Brian that he's the worst person he knows, that Brian constantly hits on his best friend's wife, while the man pays for his food and rescued him from the streets, that Brian defecates all over Peter's yard, that he's a sponge who never pays for anything and always says he'll get you later, but later never comes. That Brian pretends to be this deep intellectual, but is really just a shallow, pretentious fraud. That he acts like he cares about liberal causes, but has no idea what he actually believes in. That he's mean to people, cruel to women, and will bang anything that moves while lecturing everyone else about morality. Brian goes home and cries. Stewie finds him and comforts him, tells Brian he only needs to like himself, and that Stewie admires him. They fall asleep together in Stewie's room, and Brian farts, which is the show's way of cutting the tension with a joke. But that speech became iconic. It became one of the most quoted, most clipped, most shared scenes in Family Guy history. And the reason is simple. Fans felt like Quagmire was finally saying what they had been thinking for seasons. He articulated every complaint the audience had about Brian's character in 90 seconds of brutal honesty. Now there's an irony to this that we'll get into later when we talk about Quagmire himself, because Quagmire has done things that are objectively worse than anything Brian has ever done. The speech is hypocritical, coming from him specifically, but that doesn't make it wrong. Everything Quagmire said about Brian in that scene was true, and after that episode aired, the audience's relationship with Brian never recovered. The show tried to do something drastic to fix it. In Season 12, Episode 6, an episode called Life of Brian, Brian gets hit by a car. Not as a gag, not as a cutaway. He gets struck by a vehicle and dies on the operating table. His last words are, "You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all." The family mourns him. They adopt a new dog named Vinny, a Brooklyn-accented Italian dog, voiced by Tony Sirico. And for 2 episodes, Brian Griffin was dead. Then in Season 12, Episode 8, called Christmas Guy, Stewie finds a way to travel back in time and save Brian before the accident happens. Brian comes back to life. The whole death was erased. According to the show's mega fact sheet, this death and revival arc is one of the most talked about events in the show's history. Seth MacFarlane was essentially forced to bring Brian back because the viewer backlash was so intense. Fans were angry that Brian died, but they were even angrier when he came back so cheaply. The whole thing felt like a ratings stunt, a way to get Family Guy trending on social media without actually committing to a meaningful story. And the revival didn't fix anything about Brian's character. He came back the same pretentious, hypocritical person he was before he died. And that might be the saddest part of the whole Brian Griffin story. The show killed him and brought him back, and nothing changed. Not his personality, not his behaviour, not his treatment of others. The writers had a chance to use the death as a genuine reset, to bring Brian back as someone who had been given a second chance and wanted to be better. Instead, they just hit the undo button and kept writing the same character fans had grown to hate. What makes Brian's fall so frustrating is that you can still see the good version of him underneath all the garbage. In Season 16, Episode 6, an episode called The D in Apartment 23, Brian posts an offensive tweet and gets absolutely destroyed by the internet. He gets harassed constantly, loses his friends, and becomes a social pariah. And in that episode, Brian is genuinely sympathetic. He stands up to the mob and calls out the bullying and harassment for what it is. He behaves like the old Brian, the one who had principles and stuck to them even when it was uncomfortable. Those moments still happen occasionally. They're just buried under 10 seasons of Brian being the worst version of himself. The fan communities have a term for what happened to Brian. Multiple wiki sites, including the Loathsome Characters Wiki and the Base-Breaking Character Wiki, document his transformation in exhaustive detail. TV Tropes has an entire section on Brian's flanderization that's longer than most Wikipedia articles. The consensus across all these sources is pretty much the same. Brian went from being a sarcastic but kind voice of reason to an egotistical, selfish, hypocritical, pretentious, manipulative person who thinks he knows everything and is better than anyone else, despite failing college twice and being unable to pass a high school standardized test. The really sad thing is that Brian still has one relationship that works. His bond with Stewie remains the best part of his character. In the episodes where it's just the two of them, the road to adventures, the bottle episodes, the quiet moments in Stewie's room, you can still see who Brian was supposed to be. You can see the character MacFarlane originally created, the loyal friend, the thoughtful adult, the person who would give both his kidneys to Peter because that's how much he values the people who saved him. That Brian still exists somewhere inside the character. The show just buries him under layers of arrogance and selfishness because that version gets more laughs. Brian Griffin is the most hated character on Family Guy because he represents a promise that was broken. The promise was that, underneath all the crude humour and shock value, there was a character with real depth and real emotions. The audience invested in that promise for 8 seasons, and then the show spent the next 15 seasons demolishing it one episode at a time. But here's the irony of Quagmire calling Brian the worst person he knows. Because if you actually look at what Glenn Quagmire has done across 24 seasons of this show, Brian looks like a saint by comparison. And the fact that the show lets Quagmire lecture Brian about morality while ignoring his own behaviour might be the most uncomfortable double standard in animated television. There's another layer to Brian's story that makes the whole thing even more tragic, and it has to do with what Brian represents in the context of the show itself. See, Brian isn't just a character, he's Seth MacFarlane's self-insert. MacFarlane has talked about this openly. Brian's political views are MacFarlane's political views. Brian's taste in music and literature reflects MacFarlane's taste in music and literature. Brian's natural speaking voice is MacFarlane's natural speaking voice. When Brian went from being the show's intellectual hero to being its most mocked character, that was essentially the show's creator watching his own avatar become a punchline. And that creates this really weird dynamic where you have to wonder how much of Brian's decline was intentional social commentary and how much of it was the writing room gradually turning against the boss's favourite character. Think about what that means for the Quagmire rant scene. When Quagmire sits across from Brian and lists all of his flaws, pretentious, hypocritical, sponging off Peter, hitting on Lois, he's essentially listing the worst qualities of the character MacFarlane most identifies with. The show's creator is criticising himself through a cartoon sex offender. That's either incredibly brave self-awareness or a sign that the writing staff was subtly rebelling against the character they felt was being forced on them. Either way, it adds a dimension to Brian's story that goes beyond just bad writing decisions. Brian's evolution also tracks with something interesting about how audiences relate to intelligent characters in comedy. When a show has a character who's supposed to be the smartest person in the room, the writers have 2 options. They can keep that character genuinely smart, which limits the types of jokes you can tell, because the smart character always has to be the one who's right. Or they can gradually reveal that the character isn't as smart as they think they are, which opens up a whole new category of humour based on the gap between self-perception and reality. Family Guy chose the second option with Brian, and they chose it hard. They didn't just make Brian slightly less smart than he believed, they made him a complete fraud. The failed SATs, the terrible novel, the college dropout backstory, the pretending to have read books he's never opened. Every revelation was another brick in the wall separating Brian's self-image from the truth about who he actually is. And for the audience, that wall became the main thing they saw when they looked at Brian. Not the loyal friend, not the caring companion, not the dog who kept a gun in case he wanted to end his life, just the fraud. There's a psychological concept called the narcissistic wound that applies perfectly to what happened with Brian. A narcissistic wound is what happens when someone's inflated self-image gets punctured by reality. The person doesn't respond by adjusting their self-image. They respond by lashing out, by doubling down on their delusions, by attacking anyone who threatens to expose the truth. That's exactly what Brian does in the later seasons. Every time someone challenges his intelligence or his moral superiority, he doesn't reflect, he attacks. He becomes meaner, pettier, more manipulative, not because he's fundamentally evil, but because his entire identity is built on a foundation that keeps cracking, and he's terrified of what's underneath. And what's underneath is actually pretty sad. Underneath the pretension and the arrogance and the fake intellectualism is a dog who was born in a puppy mill, abandoned by his first family, and spent years as a stray before Peter picked him up. Brian's entire personality, the sophistication, the cultural knowledge, the liberal politics, the writer ambitions, all of it is armour. It's the identity he built to protect himself from the reality that he's a homeless dog who got lucky. And when that armor gets damaged, when someone like Quagmire tears through it, Brian doesn't have anything else to fall back on. He's not actually smart. He's not actually cultured. He's not actually a good person. He just played one on TV for 8 seasons before the mask started slipping. That's why Brian's Flanderization hits differently than Peter's or Quagmire's. When Peter gets dumber, it's just a comedian turning up the volume on an existing joke. When Quagmire gets more predatory, it's a dark comedy, pushing boundaries for shock value. But when Brian gets exposed as a fraud, it feels personal. It feels like the show is punishing a character for trying to be better than he actually is. And for viewers who identified with Brian, who saw themselves in his insecurities and his attempts to be taken seriously, that punishment felt directed at them. The Brian and Stewie dynamic deserves more attention here because it's the one thread that fans consistently point to as evidence that good Brian still exists somewhere. Stewie Griffin is a genius baby with a British accent, time travel capabilities, and a complicated relationship with his own sexuality that the show has explored in increasingly overt ways over the years. His friendship with Brian is the most genuine emotional relationship on the entire show. Not Peter and Lois, not Peter and his friends, Brian and Stewie. What makes their friendship work is that they need each other for completely different reasons. Brian needs Stewie because Stewie is the one person who sees through his pretension and likes him anyway. When Brian pretends to be sophisticated around other people, Stewie calls him on it. When Brian is genuinely hurting, Stewie drops the sarcasm and offers real comfort. Stewie doesn't need Brian to be smart or cultured or successful, he just needs Brian to be present. And that unconditional acceptance is the only thing that keeps Brian from completely losing himself in his own delusions. Stewie needs Brian because Brian is the only adult in his life who takes him seriously. Peter and Lois treat Stewie like a baby. Chris and Meg barely interact with him. But Brian engages with Stewie as an equal. He debates with him, travels with him, confides in him. Brian is Stewie's best friend in a family that doesn't understand him. And that friendship is the emotional core of the show, even when both characters are at their worst. The bottle episode in the Bank Vault, Season 8, Episode 17, is the purest expression of this dynamic. No other characters, no cutaway gags, just Brian and Stewie locked in a room for 22 minutes, talking about their lives, their fears, their love for each other, the gun in the safe deposit box, the admission of suicidal thoughts, the declaration that their friendship is what keeps Brian alive. That episode proves that when the show strips away all the noise, Brian is capable of genuine emotional depth. The problem is that the show almost never strips away the noise anymore. It's easier to write Brian as a punchline than as a person, and so the Brian who cried in a bank vault gets buried under the Brian who scammed Quagmire and gave a baby herpes. Now there's something about Quagmire's position in the show that deserves more exploration, because the way the show uses him reveals a fundamental tension in Family Guy's identity that it's never been able to resolve. Quagmire is simultaneously one of the show's most popular characters and one of its most morally indefensible. He sells merchandise, he has catchphrases, he gets memed. When people think of Family Guy, they think of Peter, Stewie, and Quagmire. He's essential to the show's brand in a way that makes him impossible to remove or fundamentally change. And that commercial reality directly conflicts with the narrative reality that Quagmire is a sex criminal. The show has tried to navigate this tension in a few different ways over the years, and none of them have been entirely successful. The first approach was just ignoring it. For the first 10 or so seasons, Quagmire's behaviour was simply not treated as serious. He was a cartoon character doing cartoon things. The show existed in a universe where consequences didn't apply to anyone, so why would they apply to Quagmire specifically? The second approach came after the culture shifted. The Me Too movement forced a lot of entertainment to reckon with characters who had previously gotten away with predatory behaviour. Family Guy's response was to acknowledge Quagmire's behaviour explicitly, having Peter call him a rapist to his face, and dedicating an episode to Quagmire facing social consequences for harassment. But these acknowledgements existed alongside episodes where Quagmire was still doing the exact same things he'd always done. The show wanted credit for awareness without actually changing anything. The third approach, and the one the show seems to have settled on in recent seasons, is trying to develop other aspects of Quagmire's character to balance out the predatory ones. His relationship with Ida, his love of cats, which led to him opening a cat cafe in one episode, his genuine friendship with Peter and Joe, his complicated feelings about growing older and being alone. These storylines give Quagmire dimensions beyond his sexual behaviour, and some of them are genuinely well written, but they don't erase what came before. You can't build 20 years of sexual assault jokes and then pivot to, actually, this guy is a cat lover with a heart of gold, and expect the audience to forget everything they saw. The Quagmire problem is really the Family Guy problem in miniature. The show built its identity on shock humour and consequence-free chaos, and now that the cultural conversation has moved past that kind of comedy, the show is trying to evolve without losing what made it popular in the first place. Quagmire is the character where that tension is most visible, because his shock humour was the most extreme, and his attempted evolution is the most transparent. Let me go deeper on Peter for a moment, because there's an aspect of his decline that I didn't fully explore earlier, and it has to do with how his intelligence changes depending on what the episode needs from him. In the early seasons, Peter was consistently stupid but functionally competent. He could hold a job, he could drive a car, he could have conversations with adults. He made bad decisions, but they were the kind of bad decisions that a real person with below-average intelligence might make. He wasn't disabled, he was just dumb. And the show derived its humour from the gap between what Peter intended and what actually happened. He'd try to do something nice and accidentally create a catastrophe. He'd try to be a good father and somehow make everything worse. The comedy came from the mismatch between effort and result, and that's a comedic formula that has worked for as long as comedy has existed. Somewhere around seasons 7 through 10, the writers started pushing Peter's intelligence significantly lower. He went from guy who makes bad decisions to guy who can barely function in society. He started doing things that were genuinely dangerous, not in a cartoon slapstick way, but in a way that should have killed him or other people. Drinking kerosene, starting fires in enclosed spaces, accidentally discharging weapons, creating situations where his children were in genuine physical danger. The gap between his intention and the result wasn't funny anymore, because the results were too severe. He went from Homer Simpson, dumb, to something more like genuinely, clinically impaired. And then the show had the petarded episode, where they officially diagnosed him as intellectually disabled. And rather than using that diagnosis to explain his behaviour or generate empathy, they used it as a comedy tool. Peter realises he can exploit his disability to get away with things. He becomes worse, not better, after learning the truth about himself. The diagnosis doesn't lead to treatment or support. It leads to abuse of the system. And that's a pretty cynical message, even for Family Guy. The intelligence inconsistency is one of the things that bothers fans the most about later season Peter. In the same episode, Peter can be too stupid to understand a simple conversation and then deliver a speech that demonstrates emotional awareness and vocabulary well beyond what his stated IQ would allow. He can't remember his daughter's age, but he can come up with elaborate schemes that require planning and foresight. He's whatever intelligence level the joke requires in that specific moment, which means he's not actually a character anymore. He's a joke delivery system that the writers adjust on the fly. Compare this to Homer Simpson, the character Peter was most obviously based on. Homer's intelligence is also variable, and The Simpsons has been criticised for similar inconsistencies. But The Simpsons established a baseline for Homer that it returns to between gags. Homer is an impulsive, emotionally driven man who is smarter than he looks, but dumber than he thinks. That baseline gives the audience something to anchor to. Peter doesn't have that anchor anymore. He's been pushed so far in so many different directions that there's no consistent character underneath the jokes. He's whoever the writers need him to be in any given scene, which means he's nobody. And that nobody is raising 3 children. He's married to a woman who used to be the show's moral centre. He's responsible for a household and the physical and emotional well-being of multiple people. The comedy of Peter Griffin was always supposed to be about the tension between that responsibility and his inability to meet it. But when the inability becomes so extreme that the responsibility stops mattering, the tension disappears. And without that tension, Peter isn't funny. He's just sad. A sad, broken man in a sad, broken show that doesn't know how to fix either of them. There's also a generational aspect to how fans respond to Peter that's worth mentioning. People who grew up watching Family Guy in the early 2000s, who were teenagers when the show first aired, often have a different relationship with Peter than people who discovered the show later through streaming. The original audience watched Peter evolve in real time. They saw the gradual decline. They can point to specific seasons where the character changed because they were watching when it happened. Newer viewers who binge the show from the beginning experience all 24 seasons compressed into weeks or months, and for them the decline is even more jarring. They'll watch 3 episodes of Season 2 Peter, who is goofy and lovable, and then skip ahead to Season 14 Peter, who is cruel and dangerous, and the whiplash is extreme. That generational divide affects how people rank Peter on lists like this one. Older fans tend to be more forgiving because they remember who Peter used to be and hold on to hope that the show might bring that version back. Newer fans tend to be harsher because they don't have the same nostalgic attachment to the early seasons. They just see the character as he exists now, and the character as he exists now is not someone most people would want to spend 2 hours of their evening with. Except here you are, spending 2 hours with him. And the fact that you're still listening, whether you're fully awake or drifting in and out, says something about the strange power of these characters. They're hated, but they're also magnetic. You can't look away from them even when you want to. And maybe that magnetic quality, that ability to hold your attention even while making you uncomfortable, is the real legacy of Family Guy's most hated characters. They're not forgettable. They're not mediocre. They're extremes, pushed to the breaking point, and then pushed further. And extremes, for better or worse, are what people remember. We're in the final stretch now. And before we wrap up, I want to talk about one more thing that connects all 7 of these characters together. Something that I think explains why this show, despite all the criticism, despite all the controversy, despite all the fans who say they've stopped watching, keeps going and keeps mattering. Family Guy is a show about terrible people. That's not a criticism, that's a description. Peter is terrible, Lois is terrible, Brian is terrible, Quagmire is terrible, Carter is terrible, Herbert is terrible, Bonnie is terrible. Even the characters we like, even Stewie and Meg and Joe, have their terrible moments. The show exists in a universe where nobody is good and everybody is broken, and the only consistent rule is that nothing ever gets better. And that sounds depressing, but there's something weirdly comforting about it, especially at 2 a.m. when you're lying in bed, half asleep, listening to someone talk about cartoon characters. Because if nobody on this show is good, then nobody has to live up to an impossible standard. If everybody is flawed, then being flawed isn't special. It's just normal. Family Guy's universe is one where the pressure to be a good person is completely removed, because good people don't exist in Quahog. And in a world that constantly tells you to be better, to improve yourself, to optimize your life, there's something oddly relaxing about spending time in a place where nobody even tries. That might be why sleep content and lore content work so well together. You don't watch 2 hours of character analysis at 2 in the morning because you need to know this stuff for a test. You watch it because it's comfortable. The voices are familiar. The characters are known quantities. Nothing is going to surprise you or demand anything of you. You can just float in this world where terrible people do terrible things and nobody ever really changes, and the worst consequence is that the episode ends and a new one starts. It's the narrative equivalent of a warm blanket. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to be there. And Family Guy has been there for over 25 years. Through cancellations and revivals and cultural shifts and controversies and cast changes and declining ratings and rising streaming numbers and everything else that's happened to television since 1999. It's been there. These characters have been there. Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire and Meg and Chris and Joe and Cleveland and Carter and Herbert and Bonnie, all of them, just being themselves. Episode after episode after episode. They're hated, and they're still here. And honestly, after 2 hours of talking about everything wrong with them, I kind of respect that. Glenn Quagmire lives at 29 Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island, right next door to the Griffin family. He's an airline pilot. He wears Hawaiian shirts. He has a prominent chin and a voice that cracks every time he says his catchphrase, which is giggity. And if you've watched even a handful of Family Guy episodes, you already know why he's on this list. But what you might not realise is just how far the show has pushed this character over the years, and how the gap between who Quagmire is supposed to be and who he actually is has become one of the most uncomfortable things about watching this show. In the early seasons, Quagmire was a pretty simple character. He was the neighbourhood ladies' man, the guy who was always chasing women and making inappropriate comments. And in the context of late 90s, early 2000s animation, that was a standard character type. Every sitcom had a version of this guy. Joey on Friends, Barney on How I Met Your Mother. The joke was always the same. He's obsessed with sex, he says inappropriate things, laugh track, move on. Quagmire was Family Guy's version of that archetype, and for the first several seasons, that's really all he was. Seth MacFarlane voices Quagmire, along with Peter, Stewie, and several other characters. According to the show's cast information, Quagmire has appeared in the vast majority of the show's 440-plus episodes, making him one of the most present recurring characters in the entire series. He's been there since the pilot, and over the course of 24 seasons, the writers kept pushing his sexual behaviour further and further until it crossed a line that a lot of fans feel the show has never acknowledged. Let's start with the stuff that's confirmed in actual episodes. In Season 5, Episode 12, an episode called Airport 07, Peter accidentally crashes into Quagmire's car, which pops open the trunk. Inside are 4 loosely dressed Japanese women who immediately scatter and run away. Peter then crashes into Quagmire's garage, releasing nearly a dozen more women. When Peter apologises and offers to go after them, Quagmire says, "They're tagged, they're tagged." That scene plays as a quick gag, a 30-second bit in the middle of a Peter story. But if you actually think about what's being depicted, Quagmire is keeping foreign women locked in his car and his garage. They run the moment they're free, and he's put tracking devices on them so he can find them again. That's trafficking. That's human trafficking played as a punchline. In Season 10, Episode 10, an episode called Quagmire and Meg, Meg turns 18, and Quagmire immediately shows up to try to have sex with her. He takes her on a date, tries to seduce her, and brings her to what the episode describes as his sex cabin. Peter has to physically intervene to stop it from happening. Lois threatens to mutilate Quagmire if he touches Meg, and the episode treats this as a Peter being protective story rather than a Quagmire is a predator story. The age gap between Quagmire and Meg is something like 43 years. He watched her grow up. He's been her neighbour since she was a child, and the day she turns 18, he's at the door trying to sleep with her, too. In multiple episodes, Quagmire is shown drugging women, taking advantage of them while they're unconscious, and engaging in behaviour that the show itself has started acknowledging as criminal. According to fan documentation sites, the show has depicted, or strongly implied, that Quagmire has committed practically every category of sex crime. And for most of the show's run, this was all treated as comedy. His catchphrase, giggity, was essentially a laugh cue that let the audience know an inappropriate sexual moment was coming. But here's where it gets really complicated, and this is the part that makes Quagmire one of the most fascinating characters to analyse on this show. Because despite being objectively worse than Brian in every meaningful way, Quagmire gets to be Brian's moral judge. That rant in Season 8, Episode 7, Jerome is the New Black, where Quagmire lists all of Brian's flaws, that speech is treated by the show and by the audience as a righteous takedown. Quagmire is presented as the truth teller in that scene. He's the one cutting through Brian's pretension and exposing him as a fraud, and everything he says about Brian is accurate, but Quagmire calling Brian the worst person he knows is like a serial arsonist calling someone out for jaywalking. The hypocrisy is staggering when you actually lay it out. Quagmire criticises Brian for hitting on Peter's wife. Quagmire himself has lusted after Lois for years. He once went so far as to invite Lois to dinner, specifically to try to get closer to her romantically. He had a full-blown affair with Cleveland's wife, Loretta, which directly caused Cleveland and Loretta's divorce. In Season 4, Episode 5, The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire. He convinced Joe to give him permission to sleep with Bonnie. He chased after Meg. He made a comment about Joe and Bonnie's newborn daughter Susie being 18 already, implying interest in an infant. This is the person the show positioned as Brian's moral superior. The Quagmire and Brian feud actually became one of the show's major recurring dynamics from Season 8 onward. After the rant, Brian initially tried to be the bigger person, but the feud escalated. Brian started deliberately antagonizing Quagmire in revenge. They got into physical fights. Brian scammed Quagmire out of money. Quagmire physically assaulted Brian on multiple occasions. The relationship became this mutually toxic back and forth, where both characters behaved terribly, but the show consistently framed Quagmire as the one with the moral high ground. The most violent confrontation happens in Season 8, Episode 18, Quagmire's Dad. This episode deals with Quagmire's father, Dan, a decorated military veteran coming to visit. Over the course of the episode, it's revealed that Dan identifies as a woman and wants to undergo gender confirmation surgery. Dan transitions and takes the name Ida. Brian, who is at a seminar in New Haven during all of this, meets Ida at a bar without knowing who she is. They hit it off, go back to her hotel, and sleep together. The next morning, Brian learns from Stewie that Ida is Quagmire's parent. Brian vomits repeatedly upon finding out. And when Quagmire discovers that Brian slept with Ida, he goes to the Griffin house and beats Brian savagely. Just physically brutalizes him. Now this scene raises a lot of questions that the show doesn't really address. Brian didn't know who Ida was. He was genuinely attracted to her and had no idea about her connection to Quagmire or her history. His reaction to finding out is played for laughs, but reads as pretty transphobic, which is its own issue. But Quagmire's response, beating Brian to a pulp for something that was genuinely an accident, gets treated by the show as justified. Quagmire faces no consequences for assaulting Brian, and the episode ends with Brian getting the last word by telling Quagmire he had sex with his dad, which is framed as Brian being petty rather than Quagmire being violent. This dynamic gets even worse in a later episode called Breda, where Ida and Brian actually start dating intentionally. Quagmire is furious and forces Ida to choose between her relationship with Brian. Ida chooses Quagmire, giving up her own happiness because her son can't handle it. Quagmire forces his own mother to sacrifice a romantic relationship because of his personal hatred for Brian. That's controlling behaviour directed at a parent. And once again, the show doesn't frame it as Quagmire being wrong. It frames it as Quagmire being protective. The show has tried to give Quagmire sympathetic storylines over the years. His sister Brenda's abuse arc in Season 10 Episode 3, Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q is one of the darkest episodes the show has ever produced. Quagmire's sister arrives with her boyfriend Jeff, who is openly and horrifically abusive toward her. The episode depicts emotional and physical abuse in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable to watch. Lois tries to talk to Brenda about leaving Jeff, but Brenda can't bring herself to do it. Eventually, Quagmire and the guys take Jeff on a nighttime hunting trip with the explicit plan to kill him. They lure him into the woods, and Quagmire runs him over with a car. Joe, who is a police officer, participates in the murder and helps cover it up. The episode wants us to see Quagmire as a protective brother who did what he had to do to save his sister. And there's a version of that story that works emotionally. The problem is that Quagmire treats women just as badly as Jeff does in dozens of other episodes. He drugs them, stalks them, lies to them, sleeps with them under false pretenses. The show wants him to be horrified by Jeff's behaviour while engaging in behaviour that exists on the same spectrum. In 2018, Family Guy tried to address this head-on. In an episode that dealt with the Me Too movement, Quagmire faces consequences for his behaviour at work. He's targeted on social media, loses his job, loses his friends, and is forced to confront his history. Peter even delivers a direct line to Quagmire in a later episode saying, "Quagmire, you're a rapist." That's the show explicitly naming what the character has been doing for 20 years. But the acknowledgement feels hollow because Quagmire is still on the show, still making sexual comments, still being presented as a member of Peter's friend group who deserves screen time and sympathy. And that's the fundamental problem with Quagmire as a character. He was created in 1999 as a cartoon womanizer, a type that was common in comedy at the time. But the show kept escalating his behaviour, season after season, without ever committing to real consequences. They wanted the shock value of making him worse and worse, while also wanting the audience to laugh at his antics and feel sorry for him during his serious episodes. You can't have both. You can't depict a character committing sexual assault as comedy for 15 years and then pivot to, actually, this guy has feelings and we should care about his family drama. The tonal whiplash breaks the character. Fans have been vocal about this for years. The loathsome characters. Wiki documents Quagmire's post-Season 8 Flanderization in detail, noting that he went from a kind of pervy womanizer to a repulsive sexual predator. Multiple ranking lists from sites like Screen Rant, WatchMojo, and WhatCulture place Quagmire among the show's most hated characters, specifically because of this escalation. Even his positive traits, like his genuine care for his sister or his complicated relationship with his parent Ida, get undermined by the show's refusal to address his predatory behaviour consistently. The thing about Quagmire that really gets under people's skin is the double standard the show creates around him. When Brian is a bad person, the show acknowledges it. Other characters call him out. Quagmire gives that famous speech. The audience is encouraged to see Brian's flaws clearly. But when Quagmire is a bad person, which is more often and more severely, the show gives him a pass. He's funny, he's charismatic, he has that catchphrase, he gets sympathetic episodes. The show protects Quagmire in a way it doesn't protect Brian, and that uneven treatment is something fans have noticed and resented for over a decade. There's a version of Quagmire that could work in a modern show, a character who is openly, comically sexual, but also kind, respectful, and aware of boundaries. The early seasons version was closer to that. He was a horn dog, but he wasn't a monster. The show chose to make him a monster because extreme behaviour gets bigger laughs. And then they chose not to deal with the consequences of that choice because dealing with consequences isn't what Family Guy does. Quagmire is the clearest example of a character who was sacrificed for shock value. They used him up, burned through every possible escalation of his premise, and now they're stuck with a character who is simultaneously one of the show's most popular figures and one of its most morally indefensible. And the irony of Quagmire's rant about Brian is that it exposed both characters at the same time. It showed us everything that was wrong with Brian, and it showed us everything that was wrong with the show's willingness to let Quagmire be the one to say it. Two deeply flawed characters, each calling the other one terrible while refusing to look in the mirror. That might actually be the most honest thing Family Guy has ever accidentally said about itself. Now let's talk about the patriarch himself. But before we do, subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying the video. Peter Griffin is the main character of Family Guy. He's the guy on the poster, the guy in the opening credits, the guy whose face is on every piece of merchandise the show has ever produced. If you know one thing about Family Guy, you know Peter. Fat guy, white shirt, green pants, thick Rhode Island accent. He works at the Pawtucket Brewery. He lives at 31 Spooner Street in Quahog. He's married to Lois. He's got 3 kids, Meg, Chris and Stewie, and he's got a talking dog named Brian. He drinks at a bar called the Drunken Clam with his buddies Quagmire, Joe and Cleveland. And he is, by almost every measurable standard, an absolutely terrible father, husband and human being. But here's what makes Peter different from Brian and Quagmire on this list. Brian and Quagmire became hated because of Flanderization, because the writers took their worst qualities and amplified them until those qualities consumed everything else. Peter's situation is both simpler and more complicated than that. Peter was always dumb. He was always reckless. He was always doing things that put his family in danger. That's his premise. That's the whole joke. The question with Peter was never whether he'd do something stupid. The question was whether the show would balance his stupidity with enough genuine love for his family that you could still root for him. And for the first few seasons, the answer was yes. But over time, the balance tipped so far in the wrong direction that Peter stopped being a lovable idiot and started being a genuine monster. In the early seasons, Peter was a clear Homer Simpson descendant. He was dumb in a way that felt warm and relatable. He made bad decisions, but his heart was usually in the right place. He worked his dead-end job at the toy factory. He hung out with his buddies at the bar. He did goofy things that annoyed Lois. And at the end of every episode, there was usually some moment where he showed that underneath all the stupidity, he loved his family. He wasn't smart enough to express it well, but the feeling was real. That's what made the character work in the beginning. You forgave the chaos because you believed in the love underneath it. The turning point that fans often cite is Season 4, Episode 6, an episode called Petarded. In this episode, Peter takes an IQ test, and the results come back showing that he's officially intellectually disabled. This is a significant moment for the character because it shifts him from average guy who's not very bright to person with a genuine cognitive limitation. And the show immediately uses this diagnosis as a comedy engine. Peter realizes that being classified as intellectually disabled means he can get away with bad behavior. He starts exploiting his diagnosis to be inappropriate. He kicks open doors in the women's restroom. He crashes into people. He takes advantage of every social protection that exists for people with disabilities and uses them as a license to be awful. The episode escalates until Peter accidentally pours hot grease all over Lois while trying to steal a deep fryer from a restaurant. She ends up in the hospital, and because Peter has been officially classified as mentally unfit, Child Protective Services takes the kids away. Cleveland is given custody of the Griffin children. Peter tries to get them back by planting prostitutes in Cleveland's house to make him look like a bad parent, which doesn't work because the social worker sees through it immediately. He eventually gets the kids back through an emotional appeal at a court hearing, but the episode establishes something that the show would lean into more and more as the seasons progressed. Peter's stupidity isn't harmless. It has real consequences for the people around him. And as the show went on, those consequences got more severe, but Peter's remorse got shallower. Peter's treatment of Meg is the thing that fans consistently point to as his worst trait, and honestly, it's hard to argue with that. The running gag that nobody in the Griffin family likes Meg started as a dark joke and became something that a lot of viewers find genuinely upsetting to watch. Peter routinely farts in Meg's face. He tells her she's ugly. He mocks her appearance, her intelligence, her social life, her romantic prospects, her very existence. In one episode, Peter and Lois discuss how they initially brought home the afterbirth from the hospital instead of the actual baby. In another, he can't even remember how old she is. The show treats Meg as a legitimate target for abuse from every direction, but Peter's cruelty toward her is the most consistent and the most personal. The most infamous Meg episode is probably Season 10, Episode 2, Seahorse Seashell Party. The Griffin family is stuck in the house during a hurricane. The power goes out. Everyone is bored and irritable. Brian eats psychedelic mushrooms and spends the episode tripping in the hallway with Stewie watching over him. But the real story is Meg. The family starts picking on her out of boredom, and for the first time in the series, Meg fights back. She turns on all of them one by one. She tells Lois that she's a terrible mother. She tells Chris that he's a terrible brother. She tells Peter that he might be the worst of all, that his kids are disasters, and his family is a mess because of him. Peter tries to laugh it off, but eventually realizes he's being genuinely attacked and runs away in tears. Lois goes after him, Chris leaves. The family starts tearing each other apart, and then Meg takes it all back. She apologizes. She tells the family that she's realized she serves a purpose. She's the family lightning rod. She absorbs their frustration and anger so they don't turn on each other. She voluntarily becomes the scapegoat again because she believes the family can't function without someone to blame. The episode ends with the family blaming Meg for the fight and everyone feeling better about themselves. Meg goes back to being the punching bag. This episode was heavily criticised by fans because it essentially told the audience that Meg's abuse is not only acceptable, but necessary. The show acknowledged that what happens to Meg is wrong, gave her a chance to stand up for herself, and then had her decide that being abused is actually her contribution to the family. That's an incredibly dark message for what's supposed to be a comedy. And Peter is at the centre of it because he's the one whose behaviour toward Meg is the most extreme and the most frequent. But Peter's awfulness extends way beyond just Meg. His treatment of Lois has gotten progressively worse over the seasons. In the early years, Peter and Lois had a relationship that felt like a functional marriage between two very different people. She was smart and patient. He was dumb and chaotic. They balanced each other out. But as the show went on, Peter stopped being a well-meaning idiot who occasionally tested Lois's patience and started being an actively harmful presence in her life. He's repeatedly put her in danger, humiliated her publicly, lied to her, and behaved in ways that, in any realistic context, would have ended their marriage long ago. In Season 5, Episode 13, Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey, Peter becomes friends with former President Bill Clinton. They start partying together, and things get out of hand. Lois goes to Clinton's hotel to ask him to stop being a bad influence on Peter. Instead, she ends up sleeping with Clinton. Now that's on Lois too, and we'll get to her later, but the point is that Peter's behaviour drove Lois into a situation where she cheated on him with a former president of the United States. His negligence as a husband created the conditions for his own humiliation. Peter's intelligence has declined so dramatically over the show's run that it's become its own form of flanderization. In early seasons, Peter was uneducated and impulsive, but could still have conversations, hold a job, and function in society. By the later seasons, Peter's stupidity has been pushed to the point where viewers genuinely question how he's still alive. He drinks kerosene, crashes through walls, picks fights with a giant chicken in elaborately choreographed battles that destroy entire city blocks, and routinely engages in behaviour that should have killed him dozens of times over. The show has addressed his own mortality multiple times, including episodes where he actually dies temporarily or ends up in comas. In one episode, Peter dreams of being on a cruise ship in the Panama Canal with numerous deceased Family Guy characters who encourage him to cross over to the other side. He refuses when he discovers there's no Wi-Fi password and wakes up right before Lois can pull the plug on his life support. That scene is funny in isolation, but it's also a perfect example of how the show treats Peter's near-death experiences as comedy without any lasting emotional impact. Lois was about to pull the plug on her husband's life. Peter wakes up and is understandably upset. He makes unreasonable demands as revenge. Things come to a head. Lois walks out with the kids intending to leave him. Peter chases them to the airport. They reconcile, and everything resets. No growth, no lasting change, no acknowledgement that their marriage came within seconds of ending, because Lois had genuinely given up on him. Peter's relationship with his friends shows another side of his declining character. In the early seasons, Peter, Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe were a believable friend group. They hung out at the Drunken Clam, played poker, went on occasional adventures, and supported each other in the way that middle-aged men do. But as Peter got dumber and crueler, his interactions with his friends became more one-sided. He uses Joe as a prop for physical comedy, once literally using him as a marionette because Joe can't move his legs. He pulls Cleveland's pants down in public. He starts fights and expects his friends to bail him out. The friendship dynamic shifted from 4 guys who genuinely like each other to 3 guys who tolerate Peter because they've known him too long to walk away. The episode that shows Peter at his absolute worst as a human being might be Season 8, Episode 16, April in Quahog. When the family thinks the world is going to end, Peter confesses something that he claims are his final words. He tells Lois, in what they believe are their last moments alive, that he has always secretly hated being around his own children. The countdown turns out to be an April Fool's joke, but the damage is done. Meg, Chris and Stewie hear their father admit that he hates spending time with them. And instead of the show treating this as a genuine crisis, a father who just told his kids he doesn't like them, it becomes a Peter has to win the kids back comedy plot that resolves with him buying them an Xbox. Think about what that says about the show's view of Peter. A father tells his children he hates being around them, and the resolution is that he buys them a video game and everything is fine. No therapy, no genuine conversation about why he feels that way. No examination of what it does to a kid to hear their parents say those words. Just a consumer purchase and a reset button. This is the pattern that makes Peter one of the most hated characters on the show. He does something genuinely terrible. There are brief consequences, and then everything returns to the status quo before anyone has to learn anything. The show has been doing this for 24 seasons. Peter never grows. He never changes. He never becomes a better father or husband or friend because the show needs him to stay exactly the same so they can keep using him as a comedy engine. And the really frustrating part is that Peter occasionally shows flashes of genuine love for his family that remind you why the character worked in the beginning. There are moments where Peter protects Meg from bullies, where he does something genuinely sweet for Lois, where he bonds with Chris or Stewie in a way that feels authentic. In Season 14, Episode 6, Peter's sister Karen visits for Thanksgiving and turns out to be a professional wrestler who bullies him relentlessly. Meg sees what's happening and intervenes, flattening Karen with a chair during a wrestling match. She tells Peter she'll always stand up for her dad, and Peter starts to apologize for how he treats Meg, begins to say something loving, but the moment passes and the status quo returns. Those moments are worse than the cruelty in some ways because they show you that the writers know Peter is capable of being better. They know the audience wants him to grow. They know there's a version of Peter Griffin who loves his family and shows it in healthy ways. They just choose not to write that version because the cruel version is easier and gets bigger laughs. Peter Griffin started as an animated everyman, a blue-collar guy in a small Rhode Island town who loved his family in his own clumsy way. He was Homer Simpson with a Rhode Island accent, and for a while that was enough. But over 24 seasons, the clumsiness became cruelty, the stupidity became dangerous, and the love that was supposed to be underneath all of it became harder and harder to find. Fans don't hate Peter because he's dumb. They hate him because the show uses his dumbness as a weapon against the people around him, especially his own daughter, and never makes him answer for it in any meaningful way. Peter is the most watched character on the show. He gets the most screen time, the most plot lines, the most attention from the writers. And all of that attention has produced a character who treats his family like props, his friends like punching bags, and his own intelligence like something he can turn on and off, depending on whether the script needs him to be functional or not. The tragedy of Peter Griffin is that he's been on television for over 25 years, and he's exactly the same person he was in the pilot, maybe worse, definitely not better. And for a character who is supposed to be the heart of a family show, that's a pretty damning legacy. Now let's shift to Lois's side of the family, because Peter married into a dynasty that makes his own dysfunction look quaint by comparison. Carter Pewterschmidt is waiting for us, and that man makes Peter Griffin look like Father of the Year. The thing that really gets me about Peter and Meg's relationship is how the show occasionally acknowledges the damage and then immediately walks it back. There are these rare moments scattered across 24 seasons where Peter gets close to being a real father to Meg, and every single time the show pulls away before anything meaningful can happen. In Season 5, Episode 3, Hell Comes to Quahog, the family buys a car for Meg, but Peter convinces the salesman to sell him a tank instead. The episode goes through the usual Peter chaos, but at the very end, after Meg resigns from her job at the Superstore USA to protect Peter from being fired, he starts to say, "I love you" to her. He almost gets the words out. And then Brian and Stewie crash through the building with the tank and destroy everything. And Peter uses the interruption to pretend it never happened. He goes back to making fun of Meg with Chris. The show literally had Peter on the verge of expressing love for his daughter and pulled the rug out. They chose the joke over the moment, and that choice has been replicated dozens of times across the show's run. In Season 14, Episode 6, Peter's wrestling sister Karen visits for Thanksgiving and bullies him mercilessly. Meg recognizes the dynamic because she lives it every day. She sees Karen doing to Peter what Peter does to her. And in the climax, Meg puts on a wrestling costume and flattens Karen with a chair to protect her father. She tells Peter she'll always stand up for him. Peter is moved. He starts to apologize for how he treats Meg. For a brief, genuine moment, there's a connection between father and daughter that feels real. And then Karen needs an organ transplant at the hospital. Peter denies being a match and leaves her to die. The episode ends with a dark joke instead of a breakthrough. The connection evaporates. The status quo returns. In Season 18, Episode 18, Better Off Meg, nobody tells Meg it was skip day at school, and her family ditches her on her birthday. She goes bowling alone. Then a news report says she was killed in a car accident, which is actually a case of mistaken identity. Meg sees an opportunity to start over and creates a new identity in a new town. Meanwhile, Chris becomes popular at school because Meg is dead. When Meg gets homesick and calls Chris, he literally shoves her into a moving van and sends her away rather than risk losing his popularity. She ends up tied up in a warehouse. She has to crack her own head against the concrete floor to create enough blood to slide out of her restraints. She escapes, goes to her own memorial service at school, and tries to tell everyone what Chris did. Nobody believes her at first. Eventually, Chris confirms the story, but continues referring to her in the past tense. At the end, Lois admits she knew Meg was faking it the whole time, and reveals that she does love her. Brian says he loves her too, but the episode's final joke undercuts even those admissions. These episodes are the ones that frustrate fans the most because they prove the writers know what they're doing. They know the Meg abuse has weight. They know the audience wants resolution. They know how to write the scenes that would give Meg and Peter a genuine breakthrough, and they choose not to. Every time. They dangle the possibility of growth and then snatch it away because the cruel version of Peter is funnier than the loving version, and the abused version of Meg is funnier than the empowered version. There's actually an episode that addresses this dynamic head-on, and it might be the most cynical thing the show has ever done. In Season 21, Episode 14, White Meg Can't Jump, Meg joins the girls' basketball team. She's terrible until she discovers that her father's mockery from the sidelines actually motivates her to play better. She channels her rage at being bullied into athletic performance. Quagmire points this out to her, and she starts bringing Peter to every game so his insults can fuel her success. Peter loses his voice, and Meg loses the game. The solution is for Peter to risk permanent vocal damage to deliver one final round of insults that wins Meg the championship. Think about what that episode is really saying. Meg can only succeed when her father is hurting her. Her best self emerges from his worst behaviour. The abuse isn't just tolerated by the show, it's presented as essential to Meg's ability to function. Without Peter's cruelty, Meg is mediocre. With it, she's a champion. That's a profoundly messed up message, and the fact that it was clearly intentional on the writer's part makes it even more troubling. And this gets to something deeper about why these characters are so hated that goes beyond individual episodes or character arcs. Family Guy has a philosophical position about human nature that it never states explicitly, but that runs through every episode. The show's position is that people don't change. People are who they are. The best you can do is figure out the system and work within it. Meg figures out that being the scapegoat is her role and accepts it. Brian learns he's not as smart as he thinks and doubles down on pretension anyway. Peter discovers he's intellectually disabled and exploits it. Lois realizes the family's dysfunctional and enables it. Every character who reaches a moment of self-awareness chooses not to grow from it. They either return to their previous behavior or find a way to make their situation work without actually improving. Compare that to a show like BoJack Horseman, which deals with similar themes of self-destructive behavior and toxic relationships, but commits to the idea that growth is possible, even if it's painful and incomplete. BoJack Horseman's characters hurt each other and themselves, but the show insists that they can learn from it. They can get better. The process is ugly and non-linear and full of setbacks, but improvement is presented as achievable. Family Guy doesn't believe that. Family Guy presents improvement as a fantasy that characters occasionally glimpse before being dragged back to where they started. That philosophical difference explains a lot about why the most hated characters stay hated. In a show that believed in growth, Brian's decline could be reversed through genuine self-reflection. Peter's cruelty toward Meg could be confronted and healed. Quagmire's predatory behaviour could lead to real consequences that change who he is. But Family Guy's universe doesn't work that way. The show needs its characters to stay broken because broken characters generate conflict, and conflict generates comedy, and comedy generates ad revenue, and ad revenue keeps the show on the air for another season. It's a closed loop. The characters are broken because the show needs them to be. The show needs them to be broken because that's what sells, and what sells determines what gets made. This is also why the Flanderization conversation matters beyond just analysing a cartoon. Flanderization isn't unique to Family Guy. It happens in every long-running show. The Simpsons, SpongeBob, The Office, Parks and Recreation, every series that runs long enough eventually reduces its characters to their most recognisable traits. But Family Guy is the show where Flanderization has been pushed to the most extreme degree because the show's humour was always more dependent on character extremes than other comedies. The Simpsons can survive Homer getting dumber because the show has other sources of humour, its satire, its cultural commentary, its heart. Family Guy's humour is almost entirely character-driven, which means when the characters get worse, the show gets worse. There's no safety net. The show's treatment of its female characters specifically has drawn increasing criticism in recent years. Meg, Lois and Bonnie have all been discussed extensively by critics who point out that the show doesn't know how to write to women as fully realised people. Meg exists to be abused. Lois exists to enable. Bonnie exists to be cruel to Joe. The female characters are defined almost entirely by their relationships to men, and when the show tries to give them independent storylines, those storylines usually end with a return to the status quo. Meg gets empowered and then goes back to being a punching bag. Lois gets angry and then gets tranquilized. Bonnie gets screen time and then goes back to being a background character who cheats on her husband. This isn't unique to Family Guy either. Animated comedies in general have struggled with female characters, but Family Guy's treatment is notable for how explicit and sustained it is. The show doesn't just neglect its female characters, it actively degrades them, and then it makes that degradation part of the comedy. Meg's suffering is funny, Lois's enabling is funny, Bonnie's cruelty is funny. The show finds humour in the diminishment of its women in a way that goes beyond typical sitcom writing and into something that feels, at times, almost hostile. Whether that hostility is intentional or just a byproduct of a male-dominated writing room churning out content for 24 years is a question fans have debated endlessly. MacFarlane himself has been asked about it in interviews, and his answers tend to fall somewhere between "it's comedy, don't take it so seriously," and "we're aware of the criticism and trying to do better." The show has made some adjustments in recent seasons. Meg gets occasional wins, Lois gets occasional depth, but the fundamental dynamics haven't changed. Peter still treats Meg terribly, Lois still enables it, Bonnie is still cruel to Joe. The adjustments feel cosmetic rather than structural. For fans who have been with the show since the beginning, watching these characters decline over more than 2 decades is a strange experience. It's like watching a friend slowly become someone you don't recognise. You remember who they used to be. You can see flashes of that person in their eyes, but most of the time, they're just this other version, this worse version, this version that makes you wonder if the person you remember ever really existed, or if you were just seeing what you wanted to see. That question, whether the early versions of these characters were genuinely better or just less revealed, is one that the show itself seems conflicted about. Some episodes treat the early characterizations as the real versions that got corrupted over time. Other episodes suggest that the characters were always this bad, and the audience was just too naive to notice. Brian was always pretentious. He just had better material to hide behind. Peter was always cruel. He just had fewer opportunities to express it. Quagmire was always a predator. The show was just less honest about naming it. If that second reading is true, then Flanderization isn't really the right word for what happened. Flanderization implies that characters were changed against their nature, but maybe these characters were just slowly stripped of their masks. Maybe Brian was always an insecure fraud performing intelligence. Maybe Peter was always a bully who needed victims. Maybe Lois was always an enabler choosing comfort over confrontation. Maybe the early seasons weren't better writing. They were just better disguises. That's a dark reading of the show, but it's one that the text supports if you look hard enough. And it's the reading that makes these characters most interesting as subjects for analysis. They're not just cartoon people who got worse because a show ran too long. They're cartoon people whose worst qualities were always there, waiting to emerge, growing stronger every season until they consumed everything else. That might be the real reason these characters fascinate people, even after all these years. It's not just that they're hated, it's that they feel true. Not true to life exactly, because nobody's life is as extreme as a Family Guy episode, but true to something about human nature. The idea that everyone has a worst version of themselves that's one bad day or one bad season or one bad decade away from taking over. The idea that the mask you wear for the world is always more fragile than you think. The idea that given enough time and enough pressure, the thing you're most afraid of becoming is exactly what you'll become. Peter is afraid of being a bad father, he becomes the worst one on television. Brian is afraid of being stupid. He becomes the biggest fraud on the show. Quagmire is afraid of being alone. He becomes someone no one should be near. Lois is afraid of losing control. She loses it completely and takes everyone down with her. Carter is afraid of being powerless. He uses his power to destroy everyone around him. These characters are defined by the thing they're running from, and every season brings them closer to it. And maybe that's why 2 hours of their worst moments make such good sleep content. Because when you're lying in bed at the end of the day, the last thing you need is a show that demands something of you. You need a show that says, these people are messed up, and that's all there is to it. No moral, no lesson, no growth, just a bunch of broken characters in a broken town doing the same broken things they've been doing since 1999. It's not inspiring, it's not uplifting, but it's honest in its own weird, animated, deeply uncomfortable way, and honestly, that might be enough. Carter Pewterschmidt is Lois Griffin's father. He's a billionaire industrialist who runs Pewterschmidt Industries. He lives in a massive mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, with his wife, Barbara. He's voiced by Seth MacFarlane, the same person who voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. And unlike those characters, who started out likeable and gradually became worse, Carter has been terrible from the very beginning. He's one of the few characters on this list who never had a golden era. There was never a period where fans loved Carter and then watched him decline. He showed up as an antagonist, and he's been one ever since. But the show keeps escalating just how bad he is, and at a certain point, even a character who was always designed to be hateable crosses a line where it stops being fun to watch. Carter's premise is straightforward. He's the rich, powerful father-in-law who hates Peter because he thinks Peter isn't good enough for his daughter. That's a classic sitcom setup. You've seen it 100 times. The wealthy father disapproves of the working-class husband. Tension ensues, laughs follow. And in the early seasons of Family Guy, that's mostly what Carter was. He showed up for holiday episodes, made cutting remarks about Peter's intelligence and income, and generally behaved like an elitist snob who couldn't understand why his daughter married beneath her station. The first time we really see Peter interact with Lois's wealthy family is in Season 2, Episode 1, Peter, Caviar Eater. Lois inherits a mansion in Newport from her wealthy Aunt Marguerite, and Peter has to navigate life among the blue bloods. He eventually bids $100 million on a vase at an auction because he's gotten confused about how much money they have, and the family has to find a way out of the financial hole. The episode establishes the Pewterschmidt world as one of old money arrogance and social hierarchy, with Carter as its most aggressive representative. But at this point, Carter is mostly just a rich jerk. Unpleasant, sure, but not evil. That changes as the seasons go on. Carter isn't just wealthy and snobbish anymore. He's racist, which the show has depicted repeatedly. In Season 9, Episode 3, Welcome Back, Carter, Peter discovers that Carter is having an affair. When Peter tries to help Carter get back into the dating scene after Barbara temporarily leaves him, a woman at a bar finds Carter attractive until he orders a black patron to get him a drink, at which point the woman calls him racist and walks away. The show acknowledges his racism explicitly in this scene. It's not subtext. Carter sees people of other races as servants, and the show depicts this as a known character trait. He's also homophobic, which is established in multiple episodes where Carter expresses disgust at homosexuality, despite having no problem with his own infidelity. He's anti-Semitic, in a way that's particularly ironic given that, according to the show's own continuity, his wife Barbara is Jewish, and he's sadistic in his treatment of Peter specifically. Carter doesn't just dislike Peter, he actively tries to destroy Peter's life on multiple occasions. He's bribed people to testify against Brian in court. He's attempted to buy off Peter with money to stay away from Lois. In one early episode, Death takes Peter back in time and shows us that Carter once knocked Peter unconscious and had his servants drop him from an airplane into the ocean. That's attempted murder. Carter tried to kill his daughter's boyfriend by throwing him out of a plane, and this is played as backstory comedy. In Season 8, Episode 9, Business Guy, Carter has a heart attack at the Fuzzy Clam after Peter gives him the bachelor party he never had. While Carter is in a coma, Lois is given control of Pewterschmidt Industries. Peter convinces Lois to let him run the company, and predictably, he makes a complete mess of it. He fires the board, hires his friends, and creates absurd products. When Carter recovers and tries to take back his company, Peter refuses. The episode eventually resolves with Lois and Carter working together to trick Peter into giving up control. What's interesting about this episode is how it shows the power dynamics in the Pewterschmidt family. Carter built a billion-dollar empire, but he also ran it with the same callous disregard for people that he shows in his personal life. His company's products and practices are depicted as harmful throughout the series. In one episode, one of Carter's ships causes an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and the family discovers this while dining at the Barrington Country Club. Carter's response to the environmental disaster is essentially to throw money at the problem and make it go away. He doesn't care about the damage his business causes because he's wealthy enough to avoid consequences. And that's really the core of why Carter is hated. He's a character who lives entirely without consequences. His money insulates him from everything. He cheats on his wife, and she stays with him. He treats his daughter terribly, and she keeps coming back. He tries to destroy Peter's life repeatedly, and Peter keeps attending family dinners. He's racist and homophobic and anti-Semitic, and nobody in his social circle holds him accountable because they're all either scared of his money or benefiting from it. In Season 4, Episode 24, an episode sometimes referred to as Peterotica, Peter writes an erotic novel that ends up getting published by Carter's company. When a distracted driver crashes while listening to the audiobook, they sue Carter as the publisher. His entire fortune is temporarily seized. Carter goes to Quahog with a rifle intending to kill Peter. Lois talks him down, and Carter ends up living with the Griffins while he's broke. Peter tries to teach Carter how to be a normal person, and for a brief moment, it seems like Carter might develop some humility. He doesn't. Barbara comes back with half of Ted Turner's fortune from their divorce settlement. Carter returns to his mansion, and nothing changes. That's the Carter Pewterschmidt cycle. The show occasionally puts him in a position where he could learn something or grow as a person. He never does. He goes back to being a monster because the show needs him to be a monster. He serves the same narrative function every time he appears. He shows up, he's awful to everyone, he creates problems through his wealth and cruelty, and eventually, the episode ends, and he goes back to his mansion to be awful another day. In Season 20, Episode 7, Pewterschmidt Manor, the Griffin family has to stay at the Pewterschmidt mansion while their house is being repaired. Carter leaves for a funeral with Lois. During the trip, Lois discovers that Carter had an affair with her childhood nanny, the one person who actually paid attention to her growing up. Carter fired the nanny to cover up the affair, so Lois's father took away the one person who made her feel loved as a child, not because the nanny did anything wrong, but because Carter needed to hide his own infidelity. That's an incredibly dark detail about Carter's character. He's not just a bad person in the present. He was a terrible father decades ago in ways that shaped who Lois became as an adult. And that gets to something deeper about why Carter is so hated. He represents a very real type of person, the kind of person who has so much money and power that they never have to face the consequences of their actions. The kind of person who can treat their family like property, cheat on their spouse, destroy people's lives, and still sit at the head of the table at Thanksgiving, acting like everyone should be grateful to be in their presence. Carter is the show's commentary on how wealth corrupts, but the commentary rings hollow because the show never actually makes Carter pay for anything he does. He loses his money temporarily and gets it back. He gets caught cheating and Barbara stays with him. He tries to kill Peter and nobody calls the police. The commentary exists, but there's no follow-through. If you compare Carter to similar characters in other animated shows, the difference becomes clear. Mr. Burns on The Simpsons is evil and wealthy, but he's also pathetic in ways that undercut his power. He's physically frail, emotionally stunted, and constantly losing to Homer through sheer incompetence. Burns is evil, but he's also a joke, and the show commits to that balance. Carter is evil, but he's never really a joke. He has too much power, too much money, and too much control over the other characters' lives to ever be truly funny. He's just unpleasant. And when a character is unpleasant without being funny, they become the kind of character that makes viewers reach for the remote. The fan community's relationship with Carter is different from the other characters on this list. Brian, Quagmire, and Peter are hated because they were once loved and then declined. Carter is hated because he was always bad, and the show refuses to do anything interesting with that badness. He's a flat villain in a show that could have made him complex. He's a one-note antagonist in a series that has proven it can write nuanced characters. Carter is boring in his evil, and for a lot of fans, that might actually be worse than being offensively evil. At least offensive evil is memorable. Carter's brand of cruelty is just tiresome. The saddest part about Carter is what his existence says about Lois. She grew up in that house, with that man as her father. She was raised by someone who cheated on her mother, fired the nanny who actually cared about her, treated everyone beneath his tax bracket as subhuman, and used his money as a weapon against anyone who disagreed with him. And then Lois married Peter, who is in many ways just a lower-class version of Carter. Peter doesn't have the money, but he has the same disregard for other people's feelings, the same inability to take responsibility for his actions, the same belief that the world exists to serve his needs. Lois escaped one terrible man and married another one who just happened to be poorer. That's either terrible writing or really dark commentary, and fans have been debating which one it is for decades. Carter Pewterschmidt is proof that money can't buy redemption. He's had 24 seasons to become a better person, and he hasn't moved an inch. He's the same racist, selfish, cruel billionaire he was in season 2, and the show seems perfectly content to keep him that way forever. For fans who want character development, who want to see people change and grow even in a comedy, Carter is a constant reminder that Family Guy doesn't really believe in growth. It believes in the reset button. And Carter is the ultimate reset button character. No matter what happens to him, no matter what he learns, no matter what he loses, he always goes back to being exactly who he's always been. A rich man who treats people like garbage and never suffers for it. Now subscribe if you're still with us, because we're about to get into a character that the show has been controversial about since the very first time he appeared on screen. John Herbert, Old Man Herbert, Herbert the Pervert. However you know him, he might be the single most uncomfortable recurring character in any animated comedy that's been on television for more than 20 years. And the fact that he's still on the show, still appearing in episodes, still being written into plot lines after all this time, says something deeply weird about Family Guy's relationship with its own worst impulses. Herbert is an elderly man who lives in the Griffin family's neighbourhood in Quahog. He has a high, breathy voice, he uses a walker, and he is a pedophile. That's not fan interpretation. That's not reading into subtext. That is literally the character's premise. Herbert is attracted to Chris Griffin. The show has depicted this attraction hundreds of times across its 24-season run. He watches Chris from his window. He invites Chris into his house. He makes suggestive comments about Chris's body. He offers Chris popsicles and tries to lure him into his basement. He calls Chris muscly arms and watches him do yard work with obvious sexual excitement. This is the joke. This is the entire joke. Herbert is voiced by Mike Henry, who also voices Cleveland Brown in the earlier seasons. According to the show's cast information, Herbert has been a recurring character throughout the series, appearing in dozens of episodes. The show's own mega fact sheet lists him as a notable recurring character, described as an elderly town resident which is the most sanitized possible way to describe a character whose entire purpose is paedophilia jokes. In the early seasons, Herbert existed almost entirely as a quick cutaway gag or a brief scene in a larger episode. He'd appear for 10 or 15 seconds, make a creepy comment about Chris, and the show would cut away to the next scene. The joke was the contrast between his frail, harmless exterior and his horrifying intentions. He looked like a sweet old grandpa, but he was actually a predator. Ha ha, move on. And in the context of early 2000s shock comedy, where shows like South Park and Family Guy were competing to see who could push boundaries further, that type of joke had an audience. It was dark, it was edgy, it got a reaction. Nobody was arguing it was good taste, but it was brief enough and absurd enough that it didn't linger. The problem is that the show didn't leave it as a brief gag. They kept bringing Herbert back. They gave him more screen time. They built actual plot lines around him. They gave him a backstory as a World War II veteran. They tried to make him sympathetic. And that's where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because there's a massive difference between a 10-second dark joke and a full episode that asks you to care about a pedophile's feelings. In one notable subplot, Herbert discovers that Chris has been replaced as his paper delivery boy by a kid named Kyle, who is also a bully. Herbert essentially goes to war to get Chris back as his paper boy, not because he cares about newspaper delivery, but because Chris is the object of his obsession. In another episode, Herbert is shown fighting off another predator who targets Chris, framing himself as Chris's protector. The show presents this as Herbert being heroic, saving the boy he cares about from danger. But the implication is deeply disturbing. Herbert isn't protecting Chris out of genuine concern. He's protecting his territory. He's fighting off a rival predator, not because what the other person is doing is wrong, but because he wants Chris for himself. And the show frames this as comedy. When the Griffin family goes into witness protection in season 3, they relocate to the Deep South. The episode ends with a reveal that Herbert has been leaving messages on the Griffin family's answering machine, all 113 of them, asking what happened to his paperboy. The joke is that Herbert is obsessed with Chris to the point of calling over 100 times. But what it actually depicts is a paedophile stalking a child who moved away, refusing to let go, continuing to pursue contact. That's the behaviour of an actual predator, played as an end-of-episode joke. What makes Herbert so uncomfortable for modern audiences is the sheer volume of these moments. If it was one joke in one episode, you could dismiss it as a dark gag in a show full of dark gags. But Herbert keeps appearing, season after season, doing the same thing over and over. The repetition normalizes the premise. After hearing Herbert make suggestive comments about Chris for the 100th time, the audience isn't shocked anymore. They're just tired, and that tiredness is what bothers fans the most. The show has taken a subject that should be treated with absolute seriousness, the exploitation of children, and turned it into background noise. It's just another thing that happens in Quahog. Herbert wants to molest Chris. Peter is dumb. Quagmire says giggity. These things are presented with the same level of comedic weight. Multiple ranking lists from entertainment publications like Screen Rant, Watch Mojo, and What Culture have placed Herbert among the most hated and most disturbing characters on the show. The criticism isn't that dark comedy can't exist. Shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia handle dark subject matter brilliantly by making the characters who do terrible things the butt of the joke. The criticism is that Family Guy doesn't commit to a perspective on Herbert. It doesn't make him face consequences. It doesn't use his character to say something meaningful about predatory behaviour. It just has him do the same creepy thing over and over and expects the audience to laugh because an old man with a funny voice. That's not satire. That's just the same joke on repeat. The defence that the show's supporters often make is that Herbert is so obviously exaggerated and cartoonish that nobody could possibly take him seriously or be influenced by his character. And there's some truth to that in the abstract. Herbert is clearly a cartoon character in a cartoon world. But the counter-argument is that the normalization of paedophilia as comedy material, even cartoon pedophilia, contributes to a culture where predatory behaviour toward children is treated as less serious than it should be. And regardless of where you fall on that debate, the fact that the debate exists at all is a problem for the show. When your audience is arguing about whether your comedy is harmful rather than laughing at it, the joke isn't working anymore. Herbert also raises questions about consistency in how the show treats its characters. Quagmire's predatory behaviour toward adult women has been increasingly criticised, and the show has started acknowledging it. Peter delivered the line, "Quagmire, you're a rapist," in a recent episode. The show is at least trying to reckon with Quagmire's worst traits, even if it's doing so clumsily. But Herbert's predatory behaviour has never been addressed with the same level of seriousness. Nobody on the show has ever confronted Herbert the way Quagmire confronted Brian or Peter confronted Quagmire. Herbert's pedophilia exists in a consequence-free zone where it's never challenged, never punished, and never treated as anything more than a running gag. That double standard bothers fans because it suggests that the show considers Herbert's behaviour less offensive than Quagmire's, which is the opposite of how reality works. In the real world, predatory behaviour is treated far more seriously than predatory behaviour toward adults. On Family Guy, it's the reverse. Quagmire faces at least some narrative pushback. Herbert faces none. He just keeps showing up, keeps making the same jokes, and keeps being written into episodes as if the audience's relationship with this character hasn't changed at all over 2 decades. Herbert is a relic of a specific era of comedy, where the goal was to shock people into laughing, where the more taboo the subject, the bigger the reaction. And he survived into an era where that approach doesn't work the same way anymore. Audiences have gotten more thoughtful about what they laugh at and why. The shock value has worn off. What's left is just an old man in a cartoon who wants to hurt children, and a show that keeps putting him on screen as if that's still funny. For a lot of fans, it hasn't been funny for a very long time, and Herbert's continued presence on the show is a reminder that Family Guy is sometimes less interested in whether a joke works than in whether it once did. The discomfort around Herbert is compounded by the fact that the show has demonstrated it can handle dark subject matter well. The Brenda Quagmire abuse episode is proof that the writers can tackle difficult topics with genuine emotional weight. They chose to make domestic abuse a serious story. They chose to make Herbert's predation a comedy bit. Those choices tell you something about the show's priorities that fans find hard to reconcile. Herbert might not be the most hated character on this list in terms of raw anger. He doesn't inspire the same passionate frustration that Brian's decline or Quagmire's hypocrisy does, but he might be the most quietly disturbing. He's the character that makes you pause the show and think, wait, they're still doing this? And that question, the realisation that the show has been making the same pedophilia joke for over 20 years without evolving it, challenging it, or retiring it, is probably the most damning thing you can say about any character on this list. Now let's move to 2 characters who share something in common. They're both women married to main characters. They both started as reasonable people, and they both became hated for the way they treat the men in their lives. We're talking about Bonnie Swanson and Lois Griffin, but don't forget to subscribe to our channel before we continue. Bonnie Swanson is Joe Swanson's wife. She lives across the street from the Griffins at 33 Spooner Street in Quahog. She's voiced by Jennifer Tilly, and for the first 7 seasons of the show, her most notable characteristic was being pregnant. That's not a joke. Bonnie was literally pregnant for the first 7 years of Family Guy. She was introduced as a pregnant woman and stayed pregnant through cancellation, revival, and recancellation until she finally gave birth to her daughter Susie in season 7. That's a long time to be defined by a single physical condition, and it kind of set the tone for how the show would treat Bonnie going forward. She was never really developed as her own character. She was always defined by her relationship to someone, or something else. First, she was the pregnant neighbour, then she was Joe's wife, and eventually, she became the woman who treats her disabled husband like garbage. Joe Swanson deserves a brief introduction here, because understanding why fans hate Bonnie requires understanding who Joe is and what he represents. Joe is a police officer who was paralysed from the waist down in the line of duty. He was voiced by Patrick Warburton from the beginning and has been one of the show's most consistent characters. Joe was introduced as Peter and Lois's new neighbour and quickly became part of Peter's core friend group, alongside Quagmire and Cleveland. In the early seasons, Joe was portrayed as an inspirational figure. He was strong, confident, capable, and didn't let his disability define him. He was the guy who could do chin-ups from his wheelchair and bench press more than anyone else at the gym. The show treated him with respect, even in a series that doesn't respect much. Over time, Joe's portrayal got more complicated. His disability became more of a punchline. Other characters started making fun of his wheelchair. His marriage to Bonnie became a source of dark humour, and Joe himself developed suicidal tendencies that the show would reference periodically without ever really addressing in a meaningful way. But through all of that, Joe remained a fundamentally decent person. He loves his wife, he loves his job, he tries to be a good friend even when Peter is making his life miserable. Joe might actually be the most genuinely good person on the entire show, which makes what happens with Bonnie so much worse. After Bonnie gives birth to Susie and stops being defined by her pregnancy, the writers needed to give her a new identity. And the identity they chose was unfaithful wife who resents her disabled husband. Bonnie starts cheating on Joe. She makes comments about how unsatisfied she is with their marriage. She mocks his disability, sometimes to his face and sometimes behind his back. She has affairs with multiple men, sometimes with Joe's knowledge and sometimes without it. The show establishes that they have some kind of arrangement where Bonnie is allowed to see other people because Joe's paralysis limits their physical relationship. But the way this is depicted makes Bonnie look cruel rather than pragmatic. The worst Bonnie moment that fans consistently point to happens in Season 13, Episode 4, Brian the Closer. In this episode, Brian gets a job in real estate and starts selling properties. One of the sales he makes is to Bonnie, who buys a house on the edge of a cliff. When the episode reveals why she chose that specific property, the implication is clear. She bought a house on a cliff because it would be easier to roll Joe's wheelchair over the edge. She's planning to murder her husband. This is played as a dark joke, just another beat in an episode full of characters behaving terribly. But it crystallizes everything fans had been feeling about Bonnie for years. She doesn't just resent Joe, she fantasizes about killing him. And the show treats this as comedy. What makes Bonnie so hated isn't just the cheating or the cruelty, it's the target. Joe is a man who was paralyzed because he was doing his job protecting other people. He sacrificed his ability to walk so that other people could be safe. He came home from that sacrifice and tried to be a good husband and father despite everything he lost. And Bonnie's response to his sacrifice is contempt. She doesn't appreciate what he gave up. She doesn't support him through the challenges of living with a disability. She cheats on him, mocks him, and apparently considers rolling him off a cliff. Fans see this as the show punishing a character who is already suffering. Joe is already the butt of disability jokes. The show already uses his wheelchair for physical comedy. Making his own wife actively despise him feels like the writers piling on. It's cruelty directed at a character who can't fight back, and the fact that it comes from his spouse, the person who is supposed to love him unconditionally, makes it worse. Bonnie also represents a pattern in the show's treatment of wives. Bonnie is cruel to Joe, Lois enables Peter and participates in abusing Meg. Loretta cheated on Cleveland, which contributed to his divorce. The show has a complicated relationship with its female characters in general, but the wives specifically are often written as either doormats or antagonists to their husbands. There's very little middle ground. Bonnie started as a nothing character, a background figure with no personality beyond being pregnant. And when the writers finally gave her a personality, they chose to make her the worst possible version of a wife. There's also the question of how the show handles Bonnie's affairs. When Quagmire sleeps with Cleveland's wife Loretta, Cleveland is devastated. The affair ends their marriage. The show treats Cleveland's pain as real and genuine. But when Bonnie cheats on Joe, the show treats it as a joke about Joe's disability limiting their sex life. The double standard is pretty glaring. Cleveland gets sympathy when he's cheated on. Joe gets punchlines. The show seems to think that because Joe is physically disabled, it's somehow more understandable or more acceptable that his wife would cheat on him. And fans find that logic deeply offensive. Bonnie's character also suffers from a lack of internal consistency. Some episodes portray her as a loving mother and a concerned wife who genuinely cares about Joe's well-being. Other episodes portray her as a cold, calculating woman who is actively looking for a way out of her marriage. The show can't decide if Bonnie is a sympathetic character trapped in a difficult situation or a villain who doesn't deserve the husband she has. And when a character lacks consistency, the audience defaults to their worst moments. Nobody remembers the episode where Bonnie was kind to Joe. Everyone remembers the episode where she bought a house on a cliff. The Swanson family in general is probably the most underwritten part of Family Guy's regular cast. Joe has become a punchline. Bonnie has become a villain. Their son Kevin went missing in Iraq and came back traumatized in a storyline that the show handled with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Their daughter Susie was a plot point for 7 seasons and then became essentially invisible. The show doesn't know what to do with this family, and Bonnie's character is the clearest example of that confusion. She's not developed enough to be interesting, not sympathetic enough to be likable, and not extreme enough to be entertaining as a villain. She exists in this uncomfortable middle ground where she's just unpleasant enough to make people change the channel when she gets significant screen time. For fans, Bonnie represents a missed opportunity. There's a version of her character that could be genuinely compelling. A woman dealing with the reality of being married to someone with a significant disability, navigating her own needs and desires while caring for a partner who requires support. That's a real situation that millions of people face, and it's full of genuine dramatic potential. But the show has never been interested in exploring it with any depth. They'd rather have Bonnie buy a murder house and call it a day. The thing about Bonnie that really sticks with people is how unnecessary her cruelty is. Peter's cruelty toward Meg drives plotlines. Quagmire's behaviour generates stories. Even Carter's awfulness creates conflict that moves episodes forward. But Bonnie's treatment of Joe doesn't serve any narrative purpose. It's not funny enough to be comedy, and it's not developed enough to be drama. It's just there, sitting in the background of the show, making fans uncomfortable every time it comes up and never being resolved or addressed. Bonnie Swanson is hated because she takes the one genuinely good man on the show and treats him like a burden. In a series full of terrible husbands, terrible fathers, and terrible people, Joe Swanson stands out as someone who is actually trying. And Bonnie's response to having a husband who tries is to resent him for not being able to try harder. For a lot of fans, that's the most depressing dynamic in the entire show. Now let's talk about Lois. And this one is going to be complicated because Lois Griffin is the character whose decline might say the most about what happened to Family Guy as a whole. Lois Griffin is the matriarch of the Griffin family. She's voiced by Alex Borstein. She's a piano teacher and occasional part-time worker at various jobs. She's the daughter of Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt. She married Peter Griffin against her father's wishes. And for the first several seasons of Family Guy, she was the glue that held everything together. She was the voice of reason. She was the responsible parent. She was the person who kept the household running while Peter created chaos, and the kids dealt with their own problems. Lois was the audience's surrogate, the character who looked at the insanity around her and reacted the way a normal person would. She rolled her eyes at Peter's stupidity. She tried to protect the kids from the worst of his behaviour. She managed the finances, cleaned the house, cooked the meals, and generally functioned as the adult in a house full of children, including the 40-something-year-old child she married. Early Lois was patient in a way that felt earned. She wasn't a pushover. She got angry when Peter went too far. She stood up for herself and her family. But she also recognised that Peter loved her in his own broken way, and she chose to stay with him because, underneath all the chaos, there was something worth holding on to. Their relationship felt real in the early seasons, messy and dysfunctional, sure, but real. You believed that these two people loved each other, even when they were making each other miserable. That's a hard thing to pull off in animation, and Family Guy managed it because Lois was written with genuine complexity. The show even gave Lois her own arcs that had nothing to do with Peter. She discovered she had a talent for martial arts in Season 3, Episode 7, Lethal Weapons, and briefly became more dominant and aggressive. She had a career as a reporter at Fox News in Season 7, Episode 10, Foxy Lady, where she exposed the network's bias. She ran for mayor. She explored her Jewish heritage. She had episodes where she was the main character, driving the story forward with her own motivations and desires. Lois was a fully realised character in a show that often treated its female characters as accessories to the male leads. So what happened? How did the most reasonable character on the show become someone that fans argue is just as problematic as the characters she used to rein in? The decline happened gradually, which is part of why it's so effective and so frustrating. It wasn't a single episode or a single moment where Lois suddenly became a different person. It was a slow erosion of everything that made her the moral centre of the show. Season by season, the writers chipped away at her patience, her kindness, her competence, and her integrity, until what was left was a character who is, in many ways, just a slightly smarter version of Peter. Lois's treatment of Meg is probably the most damning evidence against her character. Peter's abuse of Meg is obvious and crude. He farts on her, calls her ugly, forgets she exists. It's mean, but it's so exaggerated that it reads as cartoon cruelty rather than realistic abuse. Lois's cruelty toward Meg is subtler and arguably worse, because Lois is supposed to be the smart parent, the caring parent, the one who should know better. When Lois ignores Meg's problems, dismisses her feelings, or participates in the family's mockery of her, it carries more weight because the audience expected more from her. Peter's a documented idiot. Lois isn't. She chooses to be cruel to her daughter, and that choice is harder to forgive. In the hurricane episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, when Meg finally stands up for herself and calls out the entire family, the person she hurts the most isn't Peter, it's Lois. Meg tells her mother that she's a terrible parent. She tells her that she doesn't know if she wants to be around any of them when she turns 18. And Lois is devastated, not because she disagrees with what Meg is saying, but because she knows Meg is right. The show reveals in that moment that Lois is fully aware of how badly they treat Meg and has been doing nothing about it for years. She's not ignorant of the abuse, she's complicit in it, and then the show undermines even that moment of honesty. Meg apologises. She takes it all back. She volunteers to be the scapegoat again, and Lois lets her. The woman who should be Meg's protector, who has the intelligence and awareness to recognise what's happening, allows her daughter to sacrifice her own emotional well-being for the comfort of the rest of the family. Lois doesn't say, "No, Meg, you were right, we need to change." She says nothing and lets the abuse continue. That silent complicity is what turns fans against Lois more than any single cruel act could. Lois's infidelity is another area where her character has declined significantly. In the early seasons, Lois was depicted as a loyal wife who was occasionally tempted but always chose Peter in the end. Over time, the show started revealing that Lois has cheated on Peter multiple times. She slept with Bill Clinton in Season 5, Episode 13, Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey. The show has implied or depicted other affairs in various episodes. By the later seasons, the show's own writers have acknowledged through gags and cutaways that Lois is regularly unfaithful, which directly contradicts the devoted wife she was written as in the beginning. What makes this frustrating is that the show uses Lois's cheating differently than it uses Quagmire's or Brian's sexual behaviour. When Brian sleeps around, the show punishes him for it. When Quagmire is predatory, the show at least occasionally acknowledges it's wrong. But when Lois cheats, it's often framed as understandable. Of course she cheated. She's married to Peter. He's an idiot. He doesn't appreciate her. He treats her terribly. The cheating becomes a commentary on Peter's inadequacy rather than a reflection of Lois's character. The show gives Lois a pass for the same behaviour it condemns in other characters, and fans find that double standard infuriating. Lois's personality has also shifted in ways that undermine her original characterization. She was smart and grounded. She's become vain and selfish. She was patient and understanding. She's become quick to anger and slow to forgive. She was the family's moral compass. She's become someone who needs a moral compass herself. The Flanderization of Lois is less dramatic than Brian's or Peter's because it happened more slowly, but the end result is just as destructive. The Lois of Season 20 is not the same person as the Lois of Season 2, and the changes aren't improvements. One of the most telling episodes for Lois's character is Season 3, Episode 16, A Very Special Family Guy Freaking Christmas. The stress of making Christmas perfect pushes Lois over the edge. She loses control completely. She goes on a rampage through Quahog, destroying decorations, screaming at strangers, and climbing the town's Christmas tree to tear down the star on top. The family follows her. Stewie gives a speech about the meaning of Christmas that calms her down. She starts to descend the tree, and then the police shoot her with a tranquilizer dart at Peter's request. The episode ends with the family gathered around a heavily sedated Lois sitting in a rocking chair, drooling. That episode works as a dark comedy piece about holiday stress, but it also reveals something important about Lois. Under pressure, she doesn't bend, she breaks. And when she breaks, the show responds not with support, but with sedation. They literally drug her into submission. The family doesn't address the underlying stress that caused her breakdown. They don't change their behaviour. They don't help more. They just tranquilize her and pose for the closing scene. That's the show's approach to Lois in a nutshell. When she pushes back against the chaos, the show shuts her down and resets to the status quo. Lois's enabling of Peter is another major complaint from fans. In the early seasons, Lois would push back when Peter went too far. She'd tell him he was wrong, demand he fix his mistakes, and hold him accountable. As the show went on, Lois started letting things slide. Peter does something destructive. Lois sighs. Maybe they argue briefly. Then they reconcile, and nothing changes. The dynamic shifted from Lois keeps Peter in check to Lois gives up and lets Peter do whatever he wants. And that shift makes her complicit in everything Peter does. If Lois stops trying to stop him, she becomes part of the problem. The show has also given Lois some genuinely dark moments that exist independently of Peter. She's been depicted as violent, manipulative, and dishonest in ways that go beyond the normal dysfunction of the show. She's used sex as a weapon. She's manipulated her children. She's lied to protect her own interests at her family's expense. None of these individual moments are as extreme as Peter's worst behaviour or Quagmire's most predatory acts, but they add up. And they add up to a portrait of a character who was supposed to be the family's anchor and instead became just another person contributing to the chaos. What makes Lois particularly frustrating for fans is the potential she represents. She's the only character on the show who had the intelligence, awareness, and positioning to genuinely improve the Griffin family's dynamics. Peter is too dumb to change. Stewie is a baby. Brian is too self-absorbed. Meg has been broken down too thoroughly. Chris barely registers as a character most of the time. Lois was the one who could have said enough and actually meant it. She could have protected Meg. She could have set boundaries with Peter. She could have been the force for genuine growth in a show that desperately needed it. Instead, the show turned her into another source of dysfunction, and that choice tells you everything about Family Guy's philosophy. The show doesn't believe in growth. It doesn't believe in change. It doesn't believe that its characters can become better people, because better people are harder to write jokes about. Lois's decline from moral centre to complicit enabler isn't a mistake in the writing, it's a feature. The show needs everyone to be terrible, because terrible people create conflict, and conflict creates comedy. Lois being reasonable was useful for the first few seasons, when the show needed an audience surrogate. But once the show found its rhythm as a shock comedy, a reasonable character became an obstacle. So they got rid of her reasonableness and replaced it with the same selfishness and cruelty that drives everyone else on the show. Lois is hated not because she's the worst character on Family Guy. She's not. Peter is crueler. Quagmire is more predatory. Carter is more evil. Herbert is more disturbing. But Lois is the character whose decline hits the hardest because she had the furthest to fall. She started as the best version of what a Family Guy character could be. Smart, loving, patient, complex, and she ended up as just another resident of Quahog who treats the people around her with casual indifference. The tragedy of Lois Griffin is the tragedy of the show itself. Both started with genuine heart. Both had moments of real emotional depth. Both showed that underneath the crude humour and shock value, there was something worth caring about. And both gradually abandoned that depth in favour of easier laughs and cheaper thrills. Lois didn't have to become this. The show didn't have to become this. But they both did. And for fans who remember what the show used to be, that decline is harder to accept than any individual character's worst moment. There's a version of Family Guy where Lois stays the moral centre, where she protects Meg, challenges Peter, and grounds the show's crazier impulses in something resembling emotional reality. That version of the show would probably be less popular than the one we have. It would be less extreme, less shocking, less clip-worthy, but it might also be better. It might be the kind of show that people don't just watch but actually care about. And the fact that we can imagine that show but don't have it is maybe the most disappointing thing about the Family Guy we ended up with. Lois was supposed to be the heart, and when the heart stops working, the whole body suffers. 24 seasons in, Family Guy's heart has been broken for a long time, and Lois's transformation from the show's best character to just another hated one is probably the clearest evidence of that. So let's bring this all together, because when you look at all 7 of these characters side by side, a pattern emerges that says something bigger than any individual character arc. Brian was the voice of reason, who became a pretentious fraud. Quagmire was a harmless womanizer, who became a predator. Peter was a lovable idiot, who became genuinely cruel. Carter was always terrible, but the show kept making him worse without giving him consequences. Herbert was a dark joke that the show refused to retire, long after it stopped being funny. Bonnie was a nothing character, who became a vehicle for cruelty toward one of the show's only decent people. And Lois was the emotional anchor, who got dragged down into the same dysfunction she was supposed to counterbalance. Every single one of these transformations follows the same pattern. The show took whatever trait got the biggest reaction and amplified it until it consumed the entire character. Brian's intelligence became pretension. Peter's stupidity became cruelty. Quagmire's sexuality became predation. Bonnie's dissatisfaction became contempt. The writers found the frequency that got a response and cranked it to maximum volume, and what got lost in the noise was everything that made these characters worth watching in the first place. This is what 24 seasons of television does to characters when the show prioritizes jokes over development. When you need to produce 20 episodes a year for over 2 decades, the temptation to lean on what works is almost impossible to resist. Brian being pretentious works as a joke. Peter hurting Meg works as a joke. Quagmire being sexual works as a joke. These things work, so you do them again, and again, and again. And eventually, the joke is the character, and the character is the joke, and there's nothing else left. But here's the thing that makes it complicated, and this is what I keep coming back to when I think about this show. These are also some of the funniest characters on television. People hate Brian and quote his best lines in the same breath. People think Quagmire is disgusting and laugh at Giggity. Peter is a terrible father and one of the most iconic animated characters ever created. Even Carter gets laughs when his cruelty is dialed to the right frequency. Family Guy has created characters that people genuinely hate and genuinely enjoy watching at the same time, which is kind of impressive when you think about it. Maybe that's the real secret of the show's longevity. It doesn't need you to like its characters. It just needs you to watch them. And whether you're watching because you think they're funny or watching because you can't believe they just did that, the result is the same. You're watching. 24 seasons in, 440 plus episodes deep, still watching. The most hated characters on Family Guy aren't hated because they're poorly written. They're hated because they represent a choice the show made a long time ago. The choice to prioritize shock over substance, laughs over growth, and the loudest version of a joke over the most thoughtful one. Every character on this list started as something better than what they became, and every one of them could theoretically be written back to who they used to be. The show has that power, it just chooses not to use it. Maybe that's the real reason these characters are so hated. It's not just what they are, it's what they could have been. Brian could still be the voice of reason, Lois could still be the family's heart, Peter could still love his daughter, and somewhere in Quahog, in a version of this show that chose differently, maybe they do. But in the version we got, the version that's been on television since 1999, the one that's been cancelled and revived again, these characters are who they are. Broken, Flanderized, pushed to extremes that the show's creators never originally intended. And honestly, maybe that's okay. Maybe a show doesn't have to be perfect to matter. Maybe flawed characters in a flawed comedy that's been on too long still have value. Maybe the fact that we're still talking about these people, still debating whether they're sympathetic or villains, still caring enough to get angry about their worst moments, means the show is doing something right. Even if what it's doing right is making us feel something, even if that something is frustration, that's 2 hours of the most hated characters in Family Guy. Every episode, every season number, every plot detail, all verified, all real, all part of a show that has been making people laugh and cringe in equal measure for over a quarter of a century. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and we'll see you next time. And if you fell asleep during this, well, that means the show kept going and you drifted off, which might be the most Family Guy experience possible. Sweet dreams. There are a few more episodes that deserve mention because they crystallize what went wrong with specific characters in ways that are really hard to argue with. For Brian, there's the episode in season 16 where he gets exiled from the Griffin home after posting an offensive tweet that goes viral. The whole episode is about cancel culture and the way social media mobs can destroy a person's life over a single mistake. And the thing is, Brian is actually sympathetic in this episode. He made a bad joke. It wasn't meant to be hateful. But the internet turned on him, and suddenly he can't go to the grocery store without being screamed at. He can't walk down the street. He becomes a pariah over a tweet. This is the kind of story that could have been a genuine turning point for Brian's character. A moment where the audience remembers why they used to like him. He's standing up for himself. He's pushing back against mob mentality. He's defending the principle that a person is more than their worst moment. But the episode exists in a vacuum. The lessons Brian learns in it don't carry forward. The next episode, he's back to being the same pretentious, self-absorbed character he's been since season 9. The show gave him a moment of genuine growth and then erased it. And that erasure is what makes the Flanderization feel intentional rather than accidental. The writers know how to write a good version of Brian. They just choose not to keep him that way. For Peter, there's an episode in season 10 where the family wins the lottery. Peter gets exactly what he's always wanted, unlimited money to do whatever he pleases. And what does he do with it? He becomes the most insufferable person imaginable. He alienates his friends. He throws money at every problem. He becomes so arrogant that Quagmire and Joe can't stand to be around him. Eventually, he goes bankrupt and has to crawl back to his friends, and Quagmire writes him a check to save his house. The episode ends with the family back to normal, but genuinely depressed about having tasted wealth and lost it. That episode is interesting because it shows what Peter would be if he had no limitations. Remove the financial constraints, remove the social constraints, remove everything that forces Peter to interact with the world as it is rather than as he wants it to be. And you get a monster. Peter without limits is Peter at his worst. And the show seems to understand this. It uses the lottery episode to demonstrate that Peter's charm, to the extent he has any, comes from his limitations. He's funny because he's struggling. He's sympathetic because he's failing. Take away the struggle and the failure, and there's nothing left but arrogance and cruelty. That's actually a profound insight buried inside a cartoon about a fat guy winning the lottery, and it applies to every character on this list. Brian without intellectual limitations would be unbearable. Quagmire without social limitations is a criminal. Carter without financial limitations is a tyrant. These characters only function when something is holding them back, and the show's mistake over 24 seasons has been gradually removing those limiters without replacing them with anything else. The mega fact sheet for this show lists some details about the production that help explain why the characters evolved the way they did. Family Guy has gone through multiple cancellations and revivals. It was cancelled after season 3, brought back after season 4 based on strong DVD sales and syndication ratings. Cancelled again, brought back again. Each time the show came back, it came back slightly different. The humour got darker, the characters got more extreme. Or the show pushed harder because it had learned that pushing hard is what gets attention, and attention is what keeps a twice cancelled show from being cancelled a third time. That survival mentality shaped every character on this list. Brian became more pretentious because pretentious Brian gets more reaction than reasonable Brian. Peter became crueler because cruel Peter gets more clips shared on social media. Quagmire became more predatory because extreme Quagmire generates more controversy, and controversy generates more press. The characters were optimized for attention rather than quality, and that optimization is what Flanderization really is when you strip away the TV tropes terminology. It's not a writing mistake, it's a business strategy. The show also shifted from broadcast dependence to streaming prominence over its 24-year run, and that shift changed what kind of jokes worked best. On broadcast television, you need jokes that play well in real time, once, for an audience that's half paying attention. On streaming platforms, you need moments that play well as clips, as screenshots, as memes, as social media posts. The second format rewards extremes. It rewards characters doing outrageous things. It rewards moments that are so shocking or so funny or so offensive that people share them with their friends. And the characters who generate those moments most reliably are the characters who have been pushed the furthest from their original personalities. Brian going on a pretentious rant gets clipped and shared. Peter abusing Meg gets clipped and shared. Quagmire saying something horrifying gets clipped and shared. Herbert being creepy gets clipped and shared. These moments are the show's currency in the streaming era, and the characters have been shaped by that economy, whether the writers intended it or not. Understanding this doesn't make the Flanderization less frustrating for fans who remember what these characters used to be, but it does explain why it happened. These characters didn't decline because the writers got lazy or because the show ran out of ideas, although both of those things may also be true. They declined because the media landscape changed around them and the show adapted to survive. The most hated versions of these characters are also the most viral versions, and in a world where virality is survival, being hated might actually be better than being forgotten. That's the paradox at the centre of this entire video. We've spent 2 hours talking about why these characters are terrible. We've listed their worst moments, analysed their worst traits, and documented their decline, from likeable to loathsome. And in doing so, we've given them exactly what the show wants us to give them. Attention, discussion, engagement, analysis. We've thought about them more deeply in the last 2 hours than the characters probably deserve, and that attention, even negative attention, is what keeps them alive. Family Guy is a show that runs on reaction. It doesn't care if you love it or hate it. It just cares that you're talking about it. And after 24 seasons, 440 plus episodes, multiple cancellations and revivals, and a cast of characters that half the internet loves to hate, we're still talking. That's the show's greatest trick, making you care about characters you can't stand. That really is it for today. If you made it through the whole thing awake, I'm genuinely impressed. If you drifted off somewhere around the quagmire section, no judgment at all. That's what this was for. Either way, subscribe and we'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams, and remember,